In this sped up section of the video, I'm finishing to sculpt the basic body parts, which is what you guys did last week for your animal, just kind of refining the shapes a little bit. And the next part of the video, I'm going to be showing you how to hollow out the body parts. So what you see here are shavings. When I worked on this this week, I actually refined my body shapes a little bit. I took the metal loop tool and I used the technique of subtractive sculpture, where I actually carved away some clay on the feet and on the head and on the body to make a more refined body shape. So in the sped up video you saw a couple minutes ago, my shape was kind of clumsy and a little heavy and a little thick in some spots. So the shavings of clay that you see down on the table were me taking the metal loop tool and literally carving and removing the clay to get the body shapes a little bit more defined and refined. So there's my metal loop tool. You can see all those little carvings of clay. I was using water too on my fingers, kind of a combination of carving the clay away and then using my wet fingers to mold and shape the clay. So you can see that my body parts are a little bit more, I wouldn't say detailed, but a little bit more accurate. I'm going to take all this extra clay. I'm not going to waste it. You can either put it in your cup and use it for slip, or you can simply do a mini wedge by kind of squishing it all together and pounding it on the table just to get any potential air bubbles out. And then you simply place it back in your Ziploc bag, which is where you keep your wedge clay. Remember, if you have a clear plastic bag with a rubber band around it, that's unwedged clay that I gave you. Your wedge clay should be wrapped in a very damp cloth inside a Ziploc bag. And that's how you know the difference between the two bags of clay you have. And you can see I took that extra clay. I'm spraying a little water in there to make sure it's a nice wet environment so the clay stays plastic, because that's the clay I want to always come back to for sculpting. I'm going to close that up. And what I'm showing you now is my little chart for how to hollow out. I did attach a still image of this to the Google Classroom assignment so you can see. What I'm basically showing you is why it's important to hollow out any body parts that are thicker than a ½ inch. You're looking at the torso or the body of the cat. The interior is hollow. There is a vent hole out the top of the head, top of the body where the head is going to go. I have my body parts off to the side. I'm really just focusing on the head and the body right now. And I want to make sure that my head is hollowed out and that it has a vent hole, and that that vent hole connects to a hollowed out body part here, the main body part. And if your animal sits or lays on a base tile, you want to add a vent hole to the base as well and make sure it all vents out the bottom. So you're hollowing out your body as well as adding vent holes to where your limbs go. This is going to allow air to circulate so that the whole body of the animal can dry evenly. It also removes excess weight. And you're only hollowing out limbs or body parts that are thicker than a ½ inch. If it's a ½ inch or thinner, you let it be. These are the tools that you use to hollow out: a metal loop tool, or you can even use the end of a paper clip. I am going to put away my limbs right now. These are body parts that are not thicker than a ½ inch, and so there's no need for me to have them sitting out getting dry. It's very important to note that the hollowing out process must happen when the clay is leather hard. Do not do this when your clay is plastic. It will be too soft and the body parts will lose their shape, and you do not want to wait till the clay is bone dry, because at that point you can't alter or mold or shape the clay. So you're seeing me use my wire or metal loop tool to start a hole at the top of the torso near the neck and then out the bottom. And I can use either tool, the paper clip or the wire loop tool, to begin scooping and removing the clay. Again, remember, you're going for a sculpture that is even thickness throughout. You're aiming for about 3/8 of an inch thickness. That's just slightly thinner than a ½ inch. And so the idea here is I'm using these two tools to scoop the clay while the form is leather hard. And the idea is eventually those two holes will meet and I will have a completely hollow center of my body. So you see me scooping with the loop tool. I'm periodically going to check the thickness. I'm showing it to you guys so you can kind of see. Constantly looking and double checking to make sure you're scooping the clay out. And if you accidentally scoop out too much clay, you can slip and score it back in. See, I'm feeling with my fingers. I'm going for about a 3/8 of an inch thickness, and I want to make sure I'm evenly thick throughout. So I'm sort of feeling with my fingers, and the goal is to have those two holes meet in the center so that it's completely hollow on the interior of the body. Now, everybody's going to have a slightly different body form and head that they are hollowing out, so you may have individualized questions, but this is obviously just to give you a general idea of how this process works. You're aiming for a project that is even thickness. So now I'm showing you guys what happens if you accidentally pop your tool through the side wall of your animal. Well, you could just slip and score clay back onto it. Remember, it's leather hard, so you can make repairs and fix areas in case you pop through the side, but you have to be mindful of how thick your walls are. So you can see now that I finished hollowing out my body. Okay, I hollowed out through the bottom, through the top, where the neck is, and then I poked holes, vent holes we call them, through the side of the body. You'll see me point those out in just a moment. And those holes on the side are where my limbs go. And I poked vent holes there, making sure that my vent holes are not too close to the bottom edges, right? You can see that that bottom vent hole where the limbs are going to go is up about at least 1/4 to 1/2 inch from the bottom. Now I hollowed out my head. I did that as well. Using the same set of tools, I used a paper clip. And now that I've hollowed out and vented both my head and my body, I can begin to attach all the body parts together. So you can see I took my limbs back out from my workboard. And now I'm scoring the head and the body and adding slip, making sure that those two vent holes are going to line up, right? So that the air inside the head can vent out through the neck and out through the body, out through the bottom of the body. I'm using my wood tool that's on the other end of my metal loop tool to fuse my head on. So it's really important. You have to score, add slip, and fuse. It's going to be messy initially when you fuse. That's okay. You can see me using the metal rib tool that helps to kind of fuse the seams together and make sure that the clay particles are blended together. I'm using a little bit of water. Here you can use the wood fusing tool, your fingers, a paintbrush, right? And I'm just checking with my finger to make sure that my finger and the tool to make sure that the vent hole through my body matches all the way up through my neck and into my head. And now I'm ready to attach my limbs. So I'm going to use the same score, slip, fuse technique to attach the different body parts here. Using that metal rib tool to score. I have that vent hole there just to allow air to circulate and get to that limb to ensure even drying. It also reduces the weight of my sculpture, right? So a little bit of slip on both those body parts. You have to press it on firmly to make sure it's attached. Again, you're doing all this while your clay is leather hard. Then I'm making sure I fuse all the seams. So initially when I fuse it, it's going to look a little bit messy. But I'm going to clean that up later with a paintbrush or my finger or even the wood tool. I can use it a little bit more delicately. I'm fusing all the seams. I want to make sure that that leg doesn't crack and separate and fall off from the body at a later point. Okay, so a little bit of water on my finger. And I'm not so worried about refined details right now. Right now, I'm focused on making sure my body parts are hollowed out, anything thicker than 1/2 inch, and then making sure everything's properly vented, and then attaching all the basic limbs. So not doing the eyes and the ears and all that stuff just yet. Notice I put a clay support underneath the front of my animal because it's not going to be able to hold its body weight up right now, and I don't want it to fall over and get smushed. I'm putting my second hind leg on. Again, using the clay support there. You see I just made a little slip pile for myself. Adding some slip to my scored areas. Pressing it on firmly to make sure there's no air trapped between. And then I'm going to use the wood tool again, and I'll repeat the process for the forearms as well. So just a few more minutes of the video here. I want you to see these steps a couple of times because they're really important. What happens, and what I've seen happen over the years, is I have students who get lazy about the scoring, adding slip and fusing stage, and they'll skip the scoring, or they won't put enough slip on, or they don't really fuse, they just kind of stick it on. And then what happens as the project begins to dry and set, the limbs begin to crack and separate from the body. Or sometimes it looks like it's well attached, but if you don't score, slip, and fuse, then as it begins to dry, in the kiln room as it's drying and then getting ready to go in the kiln, or sometimes when it's in the kiln, if you don't score, slip, and fuse, the body parts will actually begin to crack and separate either as it's drying and getting bone dry or when it's in the kiln. And then I'll take it out of the kiln and, all the limbs will have fallen off or the head will have fallen off the body, and then the student is very frustrated. So it's really important that you follow these steps, and that's why I'm showing you how to put on all 4 limbs, because it's really key to getting your animal to stay together, right? You're going to spend a lot of time doing really wonderful detail work on these, adding eyes, adding noses, ears, textures, scales, feathers, and it would be a real shame to spend the next month working on the details of this project only to have it kind of fall apart. So it's really important that we attach everything correctly as well as hollow out everything correctly. Hollowing out is really going to prevent cracking as well. And vent holes are going to prevent explosions in the kiln, right? Because we want to make sure that if we're creating an air pocket, that the air has some way to vent out of the project or the sculpture. So I'm slipping and scoring on my last limb here as we wrap up this demo. And you can see that my cat lizard, still has a lot of work to do. She's not quite as detailed or refined as I want. I have to add a lot of details to her paws, and I have to add her ears and her eyes, and I do want to add scales and maybe some other details that weren't in my drawing originally. But it's really important that I do all this technical work first to ensure that everything stays together and it's going to successfully dry and be fired. So the next step is really figuring out, making sure that everything's hollowed out properly, everything's well attached. You see me double checking. And now I'm getting ready to store my work. Really important that we store this properly. So I'm going to get my work board out. I'm going to spray my cloth. If you run out of cloth, you can cut up an old t-shirt or use a paper towel. You can see I put clay support. Now I only need 1 clay support for her. That's right in front of her chin and chest to hold her up to make sure she's not going to fall over. Some of you might need to use 4 or 5 clay supports. It really depends on your form. I make sure my cloth is damp. I'm going to put the whole board inside my bag. I'm going to take my spray bottle and actually spray a little extra water on the cloth to make sure the environment is damp. It should not be soaking wet. If you make it soaking wet, your animal will get too wet and it will begin to collapse and fall apart. You just want it to stay leather hard. And that's it.